August 1944. Adolf Hitler issued a final, desperate command to his commander in occupied Paris: "Is Paris burning? If it falls, it must be nothing but a smoking pile of ruins." The Nazi garrison had 80 tanks, 60 artillery pieces, and 20,000 soldiers ready to execute the order. They expected a broken, terrified population. What they didn't see was the shadow army waiting just beneath their feet. In the pitch-black catacombs and hidden limestone quarries of the city, tens of thousands of ordinary French citizens, armed with nothing but stolen rifles, homemade explosives, and an ancestral fury, were about to launch a terrifying, bloody insurrection to tear the City of Light out of the grasp of the Third Reich. This is the untold story of the 6 days Paris fought for its life. August 1944. Paris. The summer heat hung heavy over the City of Light, thick with the scent of cheap tobacco, stale sweat, and the underlying, metallic tang of fear. For 4 long years, the capital of France had existed under the shadow of the swastika, its grand boulevards silenced by the rhythmic, crushing thud of jackboots. But beneath the cobblestones, in the damp, claustrophobic chill of the city's ancient limestone quarries and catacombs, a different rhythm was quickening. It was the frantic, desperate tapping of telegraph keys and the muffled clang of hidden printing presses. On the morning of August 19th, the air felt thick, charged with an invisible electricity. The citizens walked with their heads down, but their eyes were darting, searching the shadows. The German garrisons, once so arrogant in their pristine field-grey uniforms, looked frayed at the edges. They could feel it too, the sudden, suffocating realization that the city they had conquered was no longer asleep, but breathing down their necks, waiting for the spark that would ignite the powder keg. To understand how Paris arrived at this precipice, one must look back to the dark days of June 1940, when the Third Reich's blitzkrieg shattered the French army in a matter of weeks. The fall of Paris was not just a military defeat, it was a psychological castration of a European superpower. When Adolf Hitler posed before the Eiffel Tower, it symbolized the total eclipse of liberty, equality, and fraternity by the cold machinery of totalitarianism. In the immediate aftermath, the German occupation sought to project an image of civilized correction. They maintained French administration, kept the cafes open, and flooded the city with occupying troops who viewed Paris as a reward, a playground of fine wine, haute couture, and cultural prestige. For the first 2 years, the collaborationist Vichy regime under Marshal Pétain preached resignation and cooperation, convincing millions that adaptation was the only path to survival. The early resistance was a fractured, lonely affair, a lone student defacing a propaganda poster, a housewife misdirecting a German officer asking for directions, or an isolated intellectual printing a few dozen copies of an underground pamphlet in a damp cellar. It was disorganized, poorly armed, and ruthlessly hunted by the Gestapo and the Millers, the brutal French collaborationist militia. By 1944, however, the geopolitical landscape had fundamentally shifted. The German army was bleeding to death on the Eastern Front, and the Allied landings in Normandy on June 6 had cracked the Atlantic wall wide open. As the American, British, and Canadian armies ground through the hedgerows of Normandy, the disparate factions of the French resistance underwent a radical transformation. Under the fragile unification achieved by Jean Moulin before his brutal torture and death at the hands of Klaus Barbie, the various underground networks, communists, Gaullists, socialists, and right-wing nationalists, belatedly coalesced into the Forces Françaises de l'Intérieur, or the FFI. No longer just a nuisance of saboteurs, the resistance in Paris had grown into a shadow army. Numbering tens of thousands, hidden in plain sight within the cafes, metro stations, and apartment blocks of the capital. They knew the Allies were advancing, but they also knew that General Dwight D. Eisenhower's strategic plan bypassed Paris to conserve fuel and avoid a costly, destructive urban battle. The Parisians, however, refused to wait to be liberated like a helpless prize. They chose to seize their own destiny, setting the stage for a bloody, desperate insurrection against a garrison commanded by General Dietrich von Choltitz, a man who had received direct orders from Hitler himself to leave Paris as nothing more than a smoking pile of ruins if it were to fall. When the German soldiers had arrived in Paris 4 years prior, they expected a permanent holiday in the capital of European culture. They expected a population thoroughly broken by the superior martial spirit of the Aryan race, content to trade their freedom for the security of the new order. Officers dined at Maxim's, filled their suitcases with silk stockings and perfumes for their wives back home, and believed that the French spirit had been permanently extinguished. They viewed the French as decadent, soft, and incapable of the ruthless discipline required for modern warfare. Even as late as July 1944, many German conscripts, regular Wehrmacht soldiers stationed in the city, viewed Paris as a safe haven far removed from the horrific meat grinder of the Russian front. They expected to hold the city through sheer intimidation, relying on the fearsome reputation of the SS and the Gestapo to keep the civilian population compliant. They believed that a display of armored cars on the Place de la Concorde and the occasional public execution of hostages would be enough to maintain order until a strategic retreat could be organized. The reality that slammed into them on August 19 was a waking nightmare of urban warfare for which they were completely unprepared. The German soldier, trained for sweeping maneuvers across open steppes or structured defensive lines, found himself trapped in a labyrinth of hostile streets where every window was a potential sniper nest and every alleyway a death trap. The very civilians who had quietly stepped off the sidewalks to let them pass were now lunging from doorways with stolen Mauser rifles and homemade Molotov cocktails. The arrogant conquerors were suddenly reduced to terrified targets, unable to distinguish friend from foe. German couriers riding motorcycles were decapitated by piano wire strung across narrow streets. Isolated patrols were lured into cul-de-sacs and annihilated by crossfire from teenagers wearing tricolor armbands. The psychological shock was paralyzing. The soldiers of the master race found themselves besieged in their own strongholds, the Hotel Meurice, the Palais du Luxembourg, the Chamber of Deputies, listening to the constant, echoing cracks of rifles outside, knowing that the population hated them with a feral, ancestral fury and that no reinforcements were coming to save them. The historical records of those 6 days in August paint a vivid picture of a city tearing itself out of the grasp of its captors. According to documented FFI archives, the insurrection began in earnest when the Parisian police force, which had spent years enforcing German edicts, went on strike on August 15, followed quickly by postal and metro workers. By August 19, over 2,000 police officers, fully armed and wearing their distinctive cloaks, occupied the Préfecture de Police on the Isle de Law site, hoisting the French tricolour for the first time since 1940. German records from the combat group of the 325th Security Division note with growing alarm that within 48 hours, over 600 barricades were constructed across the city. These were not mere piles of debris, they were formidable defensive structures built according to historical Parisian traditions of revolution, utilizing overturned trucks, felled trees. From the boulevards, public benches, and millions of heavy cobblestones torn from the streets by men, women, and children working through the night. FFI logs estimate that their active force in the city grew from a few thousand armed militants to over 20,000 within days, though they possess fewer than 5,000 factory-made firearms. To make up the deficit, the underground workshops operated at a frantic pace, manufacturing weapons out of whatever materials could be scavenged. Documented quotes from the period reveal the raw intensity of the struggle. Henri Roltanguy, the communist commander of the FFI in the Ile-de-France region, issued a chillingly direct order to his fighters, to each his Boche. It was a call for total, decentralized warfare, urging every citizen to kill a German soldier to secure a weapon. On the other side, General von Choltitz's diaries and later testimonies detailed the immense pressure he was under from the Oberkommando der Wehrmacht. Hitler's telexes were unambiguous, repeatedly asking, "Is Paris burning?" Von Coultitz had at his disposal over 20,000 troops, 80 tanks, and 60 artillery pieces, yet his reports indicate he knew his forces were drowning in a sea of hostile humanity. Swedish Consul General Roel Nordling, acting as a neutral mediator, recorded his meetings with a conflicted Coultitz, who confessed that burning the city would serve no military purpose and would forever damn his name in history, yet he felt bound by his oath to a madman. The tension was palpable in every dispatch. On August 22, Coultitz reported to his headquarters that the entire population is in a state of rebellion, control of the streets is lost except within our immediate strongpoints. The crucible of the Parisian insurrection permanently transformed the consciousness of everyone who lived through it. For the French people, the uprising washed away the deep, corrosive shame of the 1940 capitulation and the degrading years of collaboration. It was a resurrection of the national myth, proving to themselves and to the world that France was not a passive victim to be handed from one conqueror to another, but an active participant in its own liberation. The sight of young women in summer dresses carrying ammunition boxes and elderly veterans of the Great War directing sniper fire from rooftops forged a new, democratic solidarity that transcended pre-war political fractures. For the German soldiers, the experience was a shattering disillusionment. The ideology of racial superiority and military invincibility evaporated in the face of an enraged civilian populace. The men who had marched proudly through the Arc de Triomphe in 1940 were reduced to desperate prisoners, huddled in the backs of Allied trucks, staring out at the mocking faces of the people they had once looked down upon with contempt. They realized, with absolute certainty, that the empire they had bled for was a hollow lie, collapsing under the weight of its own brutality. Throughout this bloody struggle for self-determination, a singular, seemingly mundane object began to circulate through the liberated zones of the city, carrying a profound symbolic weight that resonated far beyond its physical utility. It was the C-ration chocolate bar, specifically, the Hershey's Tropical Bar, dropped by Allied aircraft or smuggled through the lines by OSS agents and advance scouts. To a population that had endured 4 years of starvation rations, where children had grown up without ever tasting sugar and adults survived on a miserable diet of rutabagas and Azaz coffee, this small, four-wrapped block of chocolate was a revelation. It was not merely food, it was the tangible, sweet taste of American abundance and the vast, uncorrupted power of a democracy across the ocean. While the Nazi regime had spent years draining France of its wealth, requisitioning its livestock, wheat, and wine to feed the Reich, the Americans were arriving with pockets full of candy, cigarettes, and medicine. The chocolate bar became a currency of hope, a physical manifestation of a civilization that did not just possess weapons of destruction, but the industrial and moral capacity to provide sweetness, comfort, and life to a starving world. Every time a resistance fighter shared a piece of that dense, rich chocolate with a child on a barricade, it served as a silent, powerful contrast to the austere, destructive nihilism of the swastika. By August 24, the situation inside Paris had reached a critical breaking point. The FFI was running out of ammunition, and Coultitz's troops, though isolated, still held devastating firepower within their fortified pockets. It was then that Captain Raymond Dron's column of the French 2nd Armored Division, specifically the Neuve, a company composed largely of Spanish Republican exiles who had fought fascism from Madrid to the Sahara, slammed through the southern gates of the city. Their Sherman tanks, emblazoned with the names of Spanish battlefields, rumbled down the avenues, their treads clattering against the cobblestones. The news spread like wildfire through the underground networks. In the bell tower of Notre Dame, a lone resistance fighter climbed the stairs and began to pull the heavy rope. The great bell, Emmanuel, which had remained silent through 4 years of darkness, let loose a deep, booming roar that reverberated across the Seine. One by one, every church bell in Paris joined the chorus, a deafening, triumphant symphony of brass and iron that drowned out the sound of gunfire. People poured into the streets, weeping, singing the Marseillaise, climbing onto the tanks to embrace the dust-covered soldiers. The final act played out on August 25, when General Philippe Leclerc received the formal surrender of von Coulthard at the Gare de Montparnasse. Later that afternoon, General Charles de Gaulle walked down the Champs-Élysées through a delirious crowd of over 1 million people, despite the occasional crack of German snipers still hiding on the roofs of the Crillon Hotel. The underground resistance had done what many thought impossible. They had held the heart of France long enough for the liberators to arrive, saving their city from destruction and rewriting the narrative of their nation's war. The liberation of Paris remains etched in human history not merely as a tactical victory, but as a poetic testament to the unyielding resilience of the human spirit when confronted by the machinery of tyranny. The limestone walls of the city, which had witnessed centuries of human triumph and tragedy, stood washed clean of the shadow that had sought to smother them. The experience of those who fought in the shadows of the underground reveals a deeper truth about the nature of freedom, that it is never a passive inheritance, but a flame that must be tended in the darkest corners and fought for when all seems lost. The contrast between the cold, calculated oppression of the occupier and the chaotic, passionate search of the liberated city proved that the ultimate strength of a democracy lies not in the rigidity of its control, but in the boundless, unpredictable energy of its people. Long after the barricades were cleared and the cobblestones replaced, the memory of that August summer endured as a reminder that even the most brutal empires are fleeting, while the desire for liberty, once awakened in the hearts of common men and women, is an unstoppable force that no army can permanently conquer.